one has to realize that historically, Islam was virtually invisible in terms of our educational system, training of diplomats and whatnot. And it emerged, the interest emerged with the Iranian Revolution. And that interest and was driven by a negative factor, obviously, trying to understand, quote unquote, the enemy. And over the years, you've had, for many have come to see Islam through the lens of terrorist actions, however, at the end of the day, relatively small that is compared to the more than 1 billion Muslims that there are in the world, and through actually, the statements of authoritarian rulers and regimes like Ben Ali of Tunisia, Mubarak of Egypt, and of course the image of extremists and their speech, whether they're literal preachers or just more broadly people who are preachers of hate. Now, a lot has changed in the last couple of decades in the sense that Islam and the Middle East are right out front in terms of educational institutions. You find them in world history courses in high school dealing with these topics. You find them in most colleges and universities. It's visible in the media, but the fact is studies of the media show that, as is true of the media in general, media is driven by headline events, and headline events often are issues of conflict and violence. But there's still, that broader kind of coverage. And then for more than a decade, we've had the rise of what some today would call Islamophobia. That is anti-Muslim and anti-Islam attitudes and behavior. Now, this has nothing to do with the idea of criticizing a religion or criticizing the excesses or the violence that somebody does. But it's basically not saying simply these extremists are a problem, but the problem is the religion of Islam itself. So I think all of those things kind of come together. In the sense that, when somebody wants to talk about a conflict, they may have an awareness from going to school about what happened 6 centuries ago, but that doesn't motivate really what happens, today. I mean, for example, if you had even a political conflict, serious conflict between Germany and France, even though it's pretty proximate, relatively speaking, World War II or whatever, people might have that in the back of their mind, but what's really going to bring up, what they're really responding to is the current moment. Or Northern Ireland. People were responding to and continue to respond to the current moment, which they may then connect the current animosity and differences and say, well, this goes back, centuries. A lot of it has to do with, for example, if we're looking at Europe, and at that time I was talking about Europe, but it would also be true in America, but let's just take Europe. A lot of it dovetailed with the growth of anti-immigrant attitudes. Remember that a lot of the migration into Europe, certainly in the 60s and 70s, was because Europe needed workers and blue-collar workers. Now, the workers came expecting to go home, as has been true for many ethnic groups when they come, and certainly the people that invited them expected them to go home. Well, they not only came and stayed, but in fact, over the years, that size of the population has grown. And on the other hand, when economies go bad, who are you going to blame the most? And then, of course, when you have attacks as occurred in London or in Madrid, you've got conditions there. And you certainly see that right at the top of the approach of Europe, in the sense of, in Europe, you see the rise of new parties that are super conservative, far right-wing, anti-immigrant, and many of them anti-Muslim, reflecting all of these conditions. Now, what also makes for some difficulty is that it takes longer for a community that doesn't have skills to become absorbed. So if a high percentage of the people are coming as laborers and come from rural areas, then obviously interacting, a decade or two ago, they will stand out in terms of a kind of cultural, contrast. Now, this is different from the Muslim situation in America. 70% of Muslims in America, so we're setting aside African American Muslims, are immigrants who came with skills, were fleeing countries, wanting a better future, or immigrants who came here to study and wound up staying. So that's why, for example, today the American Muslim community is economically and educationally on a par with any other community in America, and in some ways ahead of it. Muslims are second to American Jews in terms of level of education. Economically, American Muslims are as well off, if not better, than your average non-Muslim American. There's a twofold problem. One problem has to do with the way in which society and government respond, i.e., if you have a media, and a significant number of media, that only focuses on extremism and doesn't cover mainstream. There's a study done by a group called Media Tenor, which is based in Europe, and they looked at Europe and America in terms of mainstream television stations, etc. And one of the things that you see over a period of a decade or two is how the number of positive stories, if you will, or if you will, mainstream stories, remains at something like 0.01%. It goes nowhere all these years later, whereas the number of negative stories goes up incrementally. So that's one. Number two, the extent to which social media, a good chunk of social media, is very anti-Muslim. I mean, you have all kinds of anti-Muslim websites. A study by the Center for American Progress in D.C., they looked at a 10-year period in which it was discovered that 7 major philanthropic organizations, if you looked at who they gave money to, not whether or not they knew what was going to happen with it. In some cases, you could be pretty sure they did, but in other cases, you couldn't. But if you look at who they gave money to, they gave $42.5 million, these 7 over a 10-year period, to individuals and websites that are anti-Muslim, websites like Jihad Watch and others. And interestingly enough, a number of these individuals and their websites are cited by the Norwegian terrorist in his manifesto as influences on the way that he thinks, etc. So you've got this, disproportionate situation. I think the other thing is that one has to realize, which is a sad fact, that whether we're talking about Muslim extremists and terrorists or other extremists and terrorists, that's here to stay. And terrorism doesn't take a lot of people. So sometimes even groups that seem very active, etc., can often be groups of 100 people, 200 people, or with a lot of terrorist acts, as in the Boston Marathon. As far as we can tell, it was 2 people. But 2 people who can wreak havoc. What they commit and the level of terror and fear tends to then distort the reality of the community or background that they come from. And so people will simply presume that these people are particularly religiously motivated. A lot of times what you see with some of these folks is that they are people who are alienated, marginalized. Some, as we've seen with situations as in Columbine and others, can be, have serious mental problems. Others have issues of deep resentment, marginalization, feeling out of it. If you look again at the Boston Marathon, the older brother clearly saw himself eventually as a loser, and at the end felt as if he didn't fit in, any place. Neither of them, even when they say that refer to their religion, neither of them were active in mainstream mosques, etc. If anything, the older one was kicked out of a mosque for rants against the sermon that was given praising Martin Luther King, etc. So it's trying to understand that really means you have to look at individuals, and you have to understand that often what drives them are psychological or political and economic feelings of marginalization, and then they may appeal to religion, but the question is, what are they appealing to? The Ku Klux Klan was influenced by Christianity. McVeigh with the Oklahoma bombing was influenced by Dominion theology, a kind of far right, radicalized form of Christianity. But when we deal with those groups, we don't think of it that way. The Center for Poverty and Law issued a report recently looking at the growth of extremism in the country. And who did they identify? They talked about the fact that since Obama came in, it's gone up 815%. But the bulk of what they were talking about are not just homegrown, they're homegrown non-Muslim groups. We have all kinds of, super right-wing groups that want to overthrow the country, that will talk about assassinating the president, or we'll talk about seceding, etc. And some of these folks have a Christian reference. They will be anti-immigrant, anti-Jew, anti-black, and their rhetoric will touch on Christianity. But we know how to vet that in our society because we're more familiar. So when you look at an extremist Christian or Jew, even if they appeal to their religion or they just come from that background, we marginalize them from the mainstream. We don't say, there go those Christians and Jews. So we don't apply what I would call a collective guilt. I think when it comes to Muslims, there's that reaction. Something happens in Boston. We've already had attacks on people after that, on Muslims after that, in which the rhetoric is where people are striking out because they see somebody as a Muslim. Not they see somebody as somebody who was hanging out with this extremist. It's that if you belong to this religion, you don't belong here. You should get out of the country. And I may not only say you have to get out of the country, but there will be physical aggression. I think that, there are a variety of things. I think that we need to apply some of the very criteria that we've talked about in light of Sandy Hook and Columbine. There needs to be more attention to identifying those who have deep psychological problems. For example, in a number of cases, you're talking about young people who are in school, and who, as people look back, were kind of marginalized. In the case of, and seem very alienated. In the case of the Boston Marathon, you have the younger brother who went to high school and seemed to be happy, went to a good high school, did well, but then he goes to university, at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, and according to reports, he was running 7 Fs. Well, universities, putting aside identifying somebody because they're going to be a radical extremist or violent, simply today we know more and more that, the job of universities, of deans as advisors, of their psychological counseling centers, there's more and more an emphasis on that, is to see students are having problems. If you've got a student that's got 7 Fs, there's a good chance that they have a psychological problem, or they have a major drinking problem, or a drug problem. But in other words, if you have a system in place where that system is identifying students who seem to be, falling at the margins, and is calling that to the attention of deans or of the psychological counseling center, then you will surface people, whether violent or nonviolent, who are problem cases. And I think that's one way of picking that out. Of finding these kinds of folks. The fact is that for decades, after independence came, which would be post-World War II, many countries in the Arab and Muslim world, basically, even though the hope was that they would now be independent, develop their own government, and people expected that in fact the people who wound up being in power or seized power were often kings, military, or ex-military. And so many countries, for example, in the Arab world, Libya, Sudan, Egypt, Syria, Iraq. You can go on with countries had that background. Okay. Now, what's interesting there then is that their legitimacy wasn't based on being elected, and the way they enforced stability and security was through their military and their security forces. And regrettably, in many cases, where did they get their arms? Who trained them? Well, It might come from the Soviet Union, but it often came from the U.S. and from European powers. And so, for example, if you look at the U.S. role in a fair number of these, countries historically, whether it's Iran, whether it's Iraq, Egypt, Tunisia. I mean, we were supporting Mubarak of Egypt and Ben Ali right up until the last minute. And even when people were taking to the streets, you had contradictions coming out between the president and the Secretary of State. That is, they would both be talking about the other sides. So you had contradictory statements. At least it seemed that way. We were the people who were, with Egypt or Iran, we were training their military in the United States, not only there. We were providing them often with the weapons, with the planes, with the gunships that fired down on people. And so that's not forgotten. And what we did is buttress up these people, because even if we said technically they didn't fit the whole notion of America as a democracy that wants to support democracy, in the name of American interest, oil, security of Israel, stability, security in the region, that was the trade-off. We would support authoritarian rulers. When you do that, you're creating a situation which is very repressive, a situation where we say we stand up for democratic rights, democratic government, human rights, but we look the other way with those countries. So it looks like it's a double standard. And you're also creating a very fragile social situation, i.e., if people live, as many did in Mubarak, people in their late 20s, early 30s, all they would have known growing up was President Mubarak. And people older, all Egyptians pretty much, all they would have known is living under authoritarian governments, going back to Gamal Abdel Nasser, to Sadat, to Mubarak. Well, you don't exactly have a culture and values of democracy and institutions. So even when there's a move towards wanting, if you will, to overthrow the tyrant, part of the problem is you don't have in place, you've got to build the democratic institutions and the outlook and the attitude. Such basic things as functioning political parties, human rights, a free press, and government not manipulating that, accountability, transparency. All of those things are there. And one of the key things is there's never been a notion in most of these countries of loyal opposition. If you oppose the regime, you were seen as someone who should be imprisoned, someone who should be tortured, someone who should be shot. And so the idea that you can have a strong, loyal opposition is a problem, not only for the people who are elected to government, but for those who are in opposition. That is, many of those who then become opposition parties, and you see this in Egypt and Tunisia, some of them want to oppose the current governments there, through the system. But a fair number of others, their attitude is not, well, we work with the process, we may not like, but we'll ride it out for 4 years. The important thing is the process, but rather they will do whatever they can, hoping to bring down that government. They will quietly appeal to the military, or to the security forces. They will, and they do, appeal to the European Union and to the United States. Basically saying, we've got new tyrants. We're the liberals. Support us. Well, some are liberals. Some are what I call illiberal Democrats or illiberal secularists. They're people who belong to the old regime. They may have been Western educated. They may have known how to talk, but the way they walked was to be very close to the regime, very close to the military. So that's what makes for the difficulty in building new democracies. Significant numbers of people in the Muslim world said, not only before, but even during and after, that they worried about and did not believe that the U.S. and Europe would act differently. And so, often into the 60 percentiles, people were very leery about too political an influence, too economic an influence. Yes, they want aid, from the IMF or even from the U.S., but their belief was, looking at the track record, it It comes with strings attached, and looking at the track record, a sense that political intervention means an attempt to control. The U.S. Invaded Iraq, supposedly to take out Saddam and have democratic elections, but in fact what many found in the early years after it, the U.S. attempted to dictate the kind of democratic institutions it would have. The U.S. had its own Ahmed Chalabi, its own selected person that they wanted to, in effect, see get elected or parachute in. And people know that. The use of economic aid. Economic aid can be used, yes, with some constructive strings attached. But, for example, if you look at some of the early rhetoric, the questions asked of an Egypt or a Tunisia, right out front were questions like, what's your policy on Israel going to be? And that's going to determine what we do. Well, Israel is a very strong ally, and the United States has a commitment to the existence and security. But when you're dealing initially with a new government, and the top agenda that you have is to talk about Palestine and Israel, which is in the region, a very significant issue, and you're almost saying, a priori, we're not going to deal with you, unless you, and we're not going to deal with you unless you do X and Y. That tends to reinforce the sense that what people knew existed for decades will continue. If you're dealing, human nature. If you have a family feud, even that here, between two families where there's a long history of 30 years, in which there's no basis for trust, and now you go to turn that around, well, there can be an initial attraction, but there's always going to be the feeling that push comes to shove, you're going to fall back, and it's not clear that the U.S. has totally walked away from what was the conventional wisdom, in terms of the sense that, supporting authoritarian governments. And in fact, there's a Zogby poll which came out just 2 weeks ago, so we're talking here, we're now into the end of April. So, okay, and I just did a program with the Center for American Progress, so people can go up and look during the April 2013. Based on that poll, there was a discussion of three of us about the future of U.S., Egypt/Muslim Brotherhood relations. But the Zogby poll shows exactly what you would think. If you ask Americans how they feel about Islam, how they feel about the Muslim Brotherhood, how they feel about Egypt, in general, they're negative. Okay? If you ask them about aid, okay, and how aid should be given or support for a government, it's based primarily on U.S. interests, and that can sound nice, but what they wind up saying is, if U.S. interest is the criterion, then whether it's a democratic or non-democratic government doesn't matter. If we think it's in our best interest to support a non-democratic party, then support a non-democratic party. And both politically, in terms of government and whether we legitimate or how we respond to them, but also in terms of aid, using it. Well, that's problematic. And it's dangerous.